Hi, heroes. Stan Lee here, inside the very spacecraft which changed the Fantastic Four from ordinary mortals to the world's greatest superheroes. And speaking of great, you won't believe today's exciting adventure, so get ready.
Over the past half-century, superheroes have found a secondary home on the small screen. Alongside their long-running adventures in comic books and their blockbuster escapades on the big screen, television has become something of a safe haven for Marvel and DC's most prominent characters. Beginning with the now iconic Fleischer Superman cartoons from the 1940s, these costume crime fighters have enthralled and inspired countless generations of audiences on TV. In animation especially, there is no shortage of great superhero shows. From the Silver Age stylings of the 1960s Spider-Man series to genre-defining cartoons like Batman the Animated Series and X-Men from the 1990s, to even more modern favourites like Spectacular Spider-Man and Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. And yet despite this near-endless list, there are several superhero projects that for whatever reason have become long forgotten by fans. These shows developed during the height of the superhero animation craze throughout the 1990s and 2000s, either failed to make it to the small screen or did air but couldn't truly endear themselves to viewers. From attempts to drastically reimagine Spider-Man to early attempts at bringing teams like the X-Men and the Justice League to life, these lost and overlooked shows offer a fascinating look into the television that shaped many of our childhoods, and allow us to consider what might have been if any of these series had captivated our hearts and minds instead. So in this video, I want to explain the history behind 5 cancelled or short-lived superhero cartoons, explain the history behind their development, and try to work out just what went wrong, and discuss the reasons why they either never saw the light of day or came and went before ultimately being forgotten. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. When X-Men the Animated Series premiered on the 31st of October 1992, the world stood witness to one of the greatest superhero television shows ever made. From the moment the now iconic Ron Wasserman theme song played for the very first time, comic book fans knew that this series was going to be unlike anything they'd ever seen on the small screen. And today, some 27 years after the show's debut, the 90s X-Men cartoon is still regarded as one of the all-time best comic book television shows, as well as one of the best adaptations of Marvel's beloved mutant team of all time. The show brought the X-Men and their world to life with a level of understanding and love to the source material largely unseen in children's television. It wasn't just a show starring the X-Men, it was the X-Men, as fans of the comics had come to know, almost perfectly translated into animation with their characters, costumes and famous storylines all brought with them. Which makes it all the more fascinating that the 1992 X-Men animated series wasn't actually Marvel's first attempts to bring Charles Xavier's Merry Mutant team to life, and in actuality, the show we eventually got came about as a result of compromises and changes made to a much different, earlier attempt at an animated X-Men TV series. So in this video, I want to break down the real history of how X-Men the Animated Series came to be, and the almost realised pilot that would have fundamentally changed everything we know about Marvel animation today, and how its downfall and demise eventually paved the way for one of the most seminal, iconic, and beloved animated shows of all time. Although the X-Men animated series that we know and love came about in the early 1990s, the history of Marvel adapting their heroes for animation actually dates back to the 1960s, with the company spotlighting a number of their most popular characters in the Marvel Superhero Show, before greenlighting standalone series for both Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four in 1967. It's almost surprising knowing that Marvel were producing shows featuring their flagship heroes for television from this period onwards, that it took until 1992 for the X-Men to receive their own series. but honestly, it wasn't for lack of trying. You see, while the first wave of Marvel animation came in the late 60s, Marvel Productions, the television and motion picture division of Marvel Entertainment, also had great success in the 1980s, producing adaptations of classic Marvel comics, including Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and NBC's The Incredible Hulk. Now, it's worth noting that Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends saw the Webhead team up with fellow heroes Iceman and Firestar, two mutants, so the X-Men actually made several cameo appearances throughout the show's 3 seasons, flaunting a design ripped straight from the pages of Chris Claremont and John Byrne's Uncanny X-Men run, and also featuring the bizarre inclusion of a now Australian Wolverine.
Want a piece of fruit?
Voiced by actor Neil Ross. Eventually, after a number of appearances in the Spider-Man series, Marvel began working on a pilot episode for a new X-Men show in the same vein, siphoning off money from the company's short-lived RoboCop animated series to put together a first attempt episode at a show that would attempt to bring to life the beloved X-Men of the late 1980s. And eventually, in 1989, this came to fruition in the form of a pilot episode entitled Pryde of the X-Men. Pryde of the X-Men was a 22-minute pilot episode developed by Marvel and New World Television, and brought to life by Toei Animation, the Japanese firm behind such shows as Dragon Ball Z, Sally the Witch, and Sailor Moon, with the script heavily inspired by issues of Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men series, being written by future X-Men and Spider-Man the Animated Series scribe Larry Parr. The pilot, narrated by X-Men co-creator Stan Lee, introduces us to a team consisting of Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Dazzler, Australian Wolverine,
Don't worry about us, Dingo. We'll make sure we can.
and newcomer Kitty Pryde, who, under the leadership of Professor Charles Xavier, attempt to save the world from Magneto and his Brotherhood of Mutant Terrorists. The episode, not only introducing us to no less than 14 major mutant characters, also showcased famous X-Men landmarks, such as the X-Mansion, which included Cerebro and the Danger Room, and the Brotherhood's base of operations, Asteroid M. The overall plot of this pilot is campy to say the least, as Magneto attempts to redirect a comet onto a collision course with Earth, blocking out the sun for years and plunging the planet into an ice age. The climax of the pilot sees the X-Men face off against the Brotherhood on Asteroid M, as the comet travels closer and closer to Earth. In the end though, the X-Men defeat the villains, and Kitty Pryde uses Magneto's power to redirect the comet to instead crash into Asteroid M, with the heroes valiantly flying away aboard the Blackbird as the comet collides with the villain's base. For her heroics, Kitty begins her initiation as a member of the X-Men, though is warned by Australian Wolverine.
So the kid got lucky. That don't make her an X-Man. Not yet.
While the pilot was certainly a little rough around the edges, the potential for this to become a successful X-Men series was there. So I guess the big question is, what happened? Well, not long after the pilot was developed in 1989, Marvel ran into some financial difficulties, eventually leading to their parent company New World Entertainment selling Marvel to McAndrews and Forbes, a holding company owned by businessman Ron Perelman. Now, this change in ownership meant that production on Marvel's various animated shows were halted, with the new owners ultimately deciding to ditch the likes of their promising X-Men series in favour of more child-orientated shows, notably Jim Henson's Muppet Babies. With Pryde now dead, the likelihood of an X-Men series ever being made seemed bleak. That is, until the former president of Marvel Productions, Margaret Loesch, took over as the head of Fox Kids in 1990, buying the X-Men TV rights and actively putting together a new pilot episode. Saban Entertainment was contracted to produce the show, who worked alongside Graz Entertainment to develop scripts, designs and storyboards, with this new pilot being animated by South Korean studio ACOM. By September 1992, a 2-part X-Men pilot entitled Night of the Sentinels was ready to air on Fox Kids, and this revised attempt at bringing the X-Men to life was not only met with huge acclaim and praise, but was eventually picked up by Fox, becoming X-Men, the animated series. In a lot of ways, the pilot episodes of X-Men the Animated Series weren't too far removed from what Pryde had attempted 3 years prior. Although the visual influence had moved on from John Byrne's late 80s X-Men to that of Jim Lee's new version of the team that debuted in 1991, a lot of the core traits of Pryde were carried over into the new series. In fact, structurally, this pilot was very similar to the story being told in Pryde, only with Jubilee being used as the audience's gateway character to the team instead of Kitty Pryde. Though it should be noted that overall, X-Men the Animated Series was tonally a much darker show than the somewhat campy Pryde, attempting to target a slightly older demographic, with the show tackling a lot of the heavy themes prominent throughout Claremont's time as the writer of the X-Men comic, and also deciding to once again make Wolverine Canadian. You don't need me to tell you though, that X-Men the Animated Series went on to become a huge success, spanning 5 seasons and maintaining a cult following to this day. But I do find it fascinating to look back at Marvel's first attempt to bring these characters to life, and think about what could have been if things had gone slightly differently. While overall, I do think the 1992 series that we got was a much stronger show overall, with a more adult-friendly concept that allowed it to tell more deeper and complex stories, this isn't to say that the Pryde of the X-Men pilot was bad, because honestly, it wasn't. Sure, it was campy, a little overstuffed, and Australian Wolverine is certainly a choice, but I genuinely think there's also a lot of potential and promise lodged within every frame of this 22-minute episode. And in many ways, it's almost comforting to know that while it may not have been the incredible show that came as a result of its downfall, the X-Men seemed to always be destined to have a show that understood and loved the very things that made their heroes unique, and translated that into the world of animation in a way that made audiences understand and love the X-Men as well. If you're someone who grew up in the 1990s or early 2000s, you likely have fond memories of the Marvel animated universe. Beginning in 1992 with the creation of X-Men the Animated Series, this interconnected series of animated television shows brought to life the biggest and most popular Marvel heroes imaginable, and allowed for whole generations to fall in love with the company's colourful characters. From the aforementioned X-Men to Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Fantastic Four and beyond, almost every major player in Marvel's comic book universe was represented in some form, each with their own catchy theme song and show that exemplified the very best of their status quo. As someone who did grow up during this period, these shows were a huge part of my childhood, and a foundational piece of me falling in love with comics and the world of Marvel specifically. And it's because of the deep reverence I have for this universe that I've long been fascinated by the story of the failed Marvel animated series, one that was planned for many years but ultimately never brought to fruition, and would star the company's first Avenger and literal flagship hero, Captain America. Despite having several cameo appearances in the likes of Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, plans were in place to produce a solo Captain America cartoon for much of the mid-1990s, adapting the character's then 50 years worth of comic book history into the world of animation. Unfortunately though, for many reasons, this show was never meant to be. However, in the decades since, many details have emerged regarding what it would have been like, and the real reasons behind its untimely cancellation. So in this video, I want to explain the history of Marvel's failed Captain America animated series, discuss the original plans for this show and its role within the company's animated universe, and the real behind the scenes factors that led to it never seeing the light of day. Ever since the mid-1960s, Marvel Comics has always had a strong presence in the world of animation. During the height of the company's renaissance, as creators like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko ushered in a new wave of heroes to launch the company into superstardom, Marvel would make a deal with Grantry Lawrence Animation to produce a series of television shows that would adapt the comic book stories of their biggest heroes. As such, in 1966, a brand new series, The Marvel Superheroes, would start to air. featuring 5 of Marvel's most popular characters: Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, the Incredible Hulk, and Namor. This show's success would lead to the creation of even more cartoons based on Marvel characters, with Grant Lawrence producing a standalone Spider-Man show the following year, whilst Hanna-Barbera would bring to life Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four. This period, widely seen as the golden age of Marvel animation, would come to an end in the early 1970s. However, despite a brief resurgence in the late 70s and early 1980s, Marvel's triumphant return to the small screen would ultimately come in 1992, when they paired with Saban Entertainment and Fox Kids to produce X-Men the Animated Series. Now, the release of X-Men rocketed Marvel animation back to the forefront of popular culture, with several other cartoons being greenlit immediately after it became clear that this show was a success. Therefore, 2 years after X-Men's pilot episode Night of the Sentinels first aired, 2 brand new shows made their way onto Fox Kids, starring the 2 Marvel properties who had experienced the most success on television, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. While Marvel's animated endeavours would only continue from this point onwards, producing several more cartoons throughout the remainder of the decade, it's here where the company also began introducing other characters in featured episodes of the existing shows, with Captain America frequently appearing and fighting alongside many of these established characters. Captain America's first ever appearance in any of these shows came in September 1995, when he and the Avengers appeared in the X-Men Season 4 episode One Man's Worth Part 1. Although this episode would be our first ever sighting of the Star-Spangled Hero, it wouldn't be the Steve Rogers we'd come to know in later appearances. Instead, this version of Cap is from an alternate universe where the Avengers are servants of Apocalypse. The real Captain America would make his debut soon after though, appearing in an X-Men flashback episode where we learn that he and Wolverine worked together during World War II to stop the Red Skull. From here, Cap would make a number of appearances in Spider-Man the Animated Series, where we learn that after his mission with Wolverine, Steve continued his battles with the Red Skull, with the duo eventually being trapped in a time vortex and escaping in the present day. As such, Cap would team up with Spider-Man in the Season 5 episode The Six Fight Again, after Electro and the Chameleon, revealed to be the sons of the Red Skull, free the duo from the vortex. From here, Captain America would return in the 3-episode Secret Wars story arc, teaming with Spidey and an assortment of other Marvel heroes to face off against an all-star team of villains. As fate would have it, it would be during the production of the Secret Wars crossover that Marvel and Saban Entertainment began discussing plans to give the first Avenger his own standalone show, with the plan being to launch the cartoon in the fall of 1998. As plans began to be put in place, news quickly broke that Captain America would finally be coming to the small screen, with the world anxiously waiting for a television series that would ultimately never arrive. By 1997, Marvel had developed a strong and successful partnership with Saban Entertainment, with the production company bringing the X-Men to life with great success over the show's 5-season run. X-Men would eventually conclude in September of that same year, and as production on its final episodes began to dawn, the two companies started to discuss ideas for their next collaboration. It was quickly decided that Captain America would be this project, and soon after, Saban put together a team of storyboard artists to begin fleshing out the look and feel for this series. This team, consisting of Will Mineo, Dave Simmons and Joe Mineo, envisaged that the show would be set during World War II, fleshing out the already established story of Cap's quest to hunt down the Red Skull, while also leaving room for the hero to appear in other shows set in the present day. The trio would produce a series of storyboards outlining the show's overall tone, with Mineo also directing a short demo reel that would showcase their plans in motion. This minute-long video featured Captain America fighting German soldiers alongside his trusted sidekick Bucky, as well as allies such as Peggy Carter and Nick Fury, seemingly establishing the wider cast of characters that would be featured in this show. While this reel was being constructed, Saban began approaching writers to help bring the show's first season to life, with Michael Reeves and Steve Englehart both being hired to work on the series. While Reeves had an extensive CV in the world of animation, writing for shows such as He-Man, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Batman the Animated Series, Englehart's role in the show is perhaps more intriguing, given his role in revitalising the Captain America comics in the early 1970s. It was during this period of the cartoon's development, though, that problems began to arise behind the scenes, as two polarising creative decisions were made that would have potentially had a drastic impact on the show's reception. You see, the writers were informed that despite the series being set during World War II, they weren't allowed to make any overt references to Nazis. This decision caused some of the plans being made by the two writers to be either significantly reworked or scrapped altogether, with Englehart specifically having to scrap an episode he had already written that would have seen the Red Skull transform Stonehenge into a giant swastika. Alongside this mandate, the writers decided to make a shocking change to Captain America's status quo, planning to reveal that Steve Rogers wasn't actually Cap's real name, and instead a code name given to him by the US military, with the character's true name in the show being Tommy Tompkins. The reaction to these changes would never be determined though, as while the show was being developed, several factors outside of the team's control led to the plug being pulled before any episodes could be aired. The main reasons for this show's cancellation was likely due to dwindling interest in the Marvel animated universe by the fall of 1998. You see, not only had X-Men the animated series concluded by the time that this cartoon entered production, but the likes of Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk and Fantastic Four had all ended as well, with the only remaining show airing at this time being The Silver Surfer. It's also worth noting that alongside this, Marvel was still facing a considerable amount of financial hardship, having only emerged from bankruptcy earlier that year. Because of this, it's likely that the two companies decided that the level of interest necessary for a show this ambitious to be successful simply wasn't there, with Saban choosing to scrap their plans for a Captain America series and instead bring to life the more low-budget Avengers United They Stand. Although this show would largely centre around characters more commonly associated with the West Coast Avengers, Captain America would make one notable appearance, guest starring in the episode Command Decision, where he confronts Ant-Man over his leadership of the group and teams up with the Avengers to stop Baron Zemo and the Masters of Evil. And with this, the story of Captain America in the Marvel Animated Universe would come to its untimely end, with his final appearance being an underwhelming cameo in a show largely forgotten by the majority of fans. A far cry from the heights of the planned standalone series that found itself lost to history. Despite never making it to air and only getting as far as the early stages of production, I think that this failed Captain America series has an interesting legacy in the history of Marvel's animation, coming at the twilight of the company's once celebrated animated universe, which had enthralled audiences for much of the 1990s. This show's cancellation very much symbolised the end of an era, as Marvel began to phase out this generation of cartoons and began rebuilding for the new millennium. In the years after this series was scrapped, only two more shows that were part of Marvel's animated universe were released: the aforementioned Avengers United They Stand and Spider-Man Unlimited, with both being short-lived and rarely remembered by the majority of fans. Because of this, it's hard to say whether or not a Captain America show would have revitalised interest in the company's animated endeavours, especially given the time in which it was being developed. Had the show been greenlit a few years earlier, around the time that the character first started to appear in other series, it's likely that this show would not only have made it to air, but actually have been successful, emerging around the same time that X-Men and Spider-Man were beginning to come to an end, and being able to carry the torch as Marvel's new flagship show. By the end of 1998 though, audiences had largely moved on from the Marvel animated universe, and given the controversial changes that would have been made to the hero status quo, there was no guarantee that the remaining viewers would have fallen in love with this new iteration of the first Avenger. Instead though, this series never saw the light of day, and in its place, Marvel would instead move on to producing a new slate of animated shows, finding success in the subsequent decade with the likes of X-Men Evolution, Spectacular Spider-Man and Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, the latter of which would feature Captain America as one of the show's main characters. While Cap would continue to make frequent appearances in many of Marvel's other animated shows, the hero would never actually be given the chance to star in his own standalone series, with this short-lived attempt to bring his Golden Age adventures to life being the closest that anyone would ever come. For me personally, I think that had this proposed series made it to air, it likely wouldn't have lived up to its exciting potential. Despite the many talented names involved in trying to bring it to life, the combined forces of the dwindling interest in Marvel's cartoons at this time, and the divisive changes made to Steve Rogers' character would have only served to have made this show controversial and underwhelming. It's no surprise that its replacement series, Avengers United They Stand, failed for many of these exact reasons, and it's hard to imagine a world where, in this context, a Captain America animated series could have been brought to life and found the success that it truly deserved. A show featuring one of Marvel's very first superheroes and a character who had helped carry the company on their back for generations should be one of their greatest successes, especially given all of the other heroes that the company were able to brilliantly bring to life throughout the 1990s. However, the story of this failed animated series is above all else one of a major missed opportunity, and a failure to capture the essence of what exactly makes Captain America one of the most beloved superheroes of all time. The 1990s was truly an unquestionable golden age for Marvel animation. Throughout the decade, the company, in partnership with Fox Kids, created many popular and iconic animated shows, bringing their vast array of characters to life and allowing whole generations of fans to fall in love with the Marvel Universe. Beginning with 1992's X-Men the Animated Series, Marvel, Fox and Saban Entertainment produced 8 animated shows throughout the decade that showcased their most well-known and popular characters. However, in this all-star lineup of now beloved heroes, there is one show that often goes overlooked and ignored by fans, that being the 1999 series, Avengers United They Stand. Produced as the final show in this era of Marvel animation, United They Stand only ran for one 13-episode season and reimagined Earth's mightiest heroes as a futuristic superhero team with a roster far removed from the pop culture titans you expect from the team today. As such, it's a series that has largely fallen into obscurity in the years since it was first brought to screen, and in this video I want to go back and re-examine Avengers United They Stand, explain the history of how this show came to be and its place within the Marvel animated universe at the time, as well as try to understand just what went wrong behind the scenes and why the show failed to deliver on its exciting premise, and how it ultimately became Marvel's forgotten animated series. In 1996, Marvel's animated TV series had become a staple of children's television, particularly on Fox Kids, whose regular lineup consisted of 5 unique Marvel shows, including the massively popular X-Men and Spider-Man animated series. With the huge success of these initial 5 shows, Fox's supervising executive of animated series, Roland Poindexter, approached 2 of the writers behind X-Men the Animated Series, Robert Skir and Marty Eisenberg, to begin pitching ideas for a brand new show, this one focused around the Avengers. Now, given that Marvel and Fox had already brought to life the likes of Spider-Man, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, with a Silver Surfer show already in development, it made tremendous sense that Earth's mightiest heroes would be next, especially given that many of the team's members had already made appearances in the other existing shows. As such, Skir and Eisenberg produced an outline for a 13-episode season that was pitched to Fox's executives. Once Fox had approved their Avengers pitch though, production on this show was halted for an entire year as a result of Marvel Comics' ongoing bankruptcy problems, with pre-production eventually beginning in 1998. This delay had a number of significant side effects on the show's development. Notably, although Saban Entertainment had been brought in to animate the show, the initial writers had moved on to other projects, and as a result, Eric and Julia Lewald, 2 of the key creative figures behind X-Men the Animated Series, took over as the new screenwriters, adapting the initial draft into what would become United They Stand. However, as soon as production got underway, issues behind the scenes began to arise, namely due to complications over licensing issues with Captain America, Iron Man and Thor. It was decided that the trio would not be key characters in this show, with only the first two of these heroes even making cameo appearances in individual episodes. This meant that despite the fact the Avengers had already appeared in the Fantastic Four series, this new show would have a completely unique lineup. While this may not have been ideal for those producing the show, the writers did attempt to use these constraints as a way to spotlight lesser known members of the team, with Eric Lewald stating that "We want this to be a team of Avengers, instead of making it Captain America in the Avengers or Thor in the Avengers. We prefer to have a balanced team of superheroes rather than a superstar on the team, with the eventual team that we would follow in United They Stand closely resembling the West Coast Avengers from the mid-1980s. Another notable creative decision that arose during the show's production was its time setting, as United They Stand was surprisingly set some 25 years in the future. Now, it's worth noting that because of its delayed development, this show was being produced alongside Spider-Man Unlimited, and both of these shows seem to share this futuristic setting, likely a result of Marvel and Fox seeking to compete with Warner Bros.' recently premiering Batman Beyond animated show. While somewhat unexpected, this futuristic time period enabled the writers to explore aspects of the Marvel animated universe that we hadn't seen previously, as well as giving them the ability to craft a more unique backdrop for the Avengers to fight in, with producer Ron Myrick claiming that the show's primary location, New York City, will be a mix of future and contemporary looks, sort of the way the city looked in the movie Blade Runner, but not as dark. With both the new lineup and the world of this show now created, it was now time for Earth's Mightiest Heroes to emerge, and on the 30th of October 1999, United They Stand premiered on Fox Kids, and the Avengers finally made their way to the small screen. The initial 13-episode season of United They Stand attempted to expand the lore of the traditional Avengers team, introducing viewers to a new band of heroes who have taken over from the likes of Captain America and Iron Man in the near future. This team, led by Hank Pym aka Ant-Man, consisted of him and his wife Wasp, alongside the likes of Falcon, Wonder Man, Tigra and Vision, as well as Hawkeye and the Scarlet Witch, who had both previously appeared in the Iron Man animated series. The season began with a two-part episode entitled Avengers Assemble, which saw this new team face off against the villainous robot Ultron, who creates the Vision and sends him to kill the Avengers, in an attempt to get revenge on his own creator, Hank Pym. As such, Vision attacks the Avengers mansion, and his actions put Wonder Man into a coma, before the heroes are able to reprogram the android, and he ultimately chooses to join the fight against his creator, and becoming a full-fledged member of the Avengers. In addition to Ultron's appearances in the two-part premiere, the series would introduce a number of notable Avengers foes, such as Baron Zemo, the Grim Reaper, the Masters of Evil, and Kang the Conqueror, as well as various supporting characters such as Agatha Harkness and Namor the Submariner. To me, one of the most interesting and noteworthy episodes, though, is Command Decision, which first aired on the 11th of December 1999. This episode sees the Avengers team up with Captain America to face off against the Masters of Evil, and honestly, it does a decent job of establishing the lore of this new Avengers team, with Cap returning as the former leader, which in turn causes Ant-Man to question his own place in the group. Likewise, the episode Shooting Stars, which first aired on the 22nd of January 2000, involves the Avengers facing off against an evil organisation known as the Zodiac, who they discover are attempting to blast satellites out of orbit and create chaos around the world. As the heroes prepare to head into outer space to stop the Zodiac, they enlist the help of Iron Man, as the founding Avenger teams up with this new team to save the day. Despite the appearances of these two iconic characters though, there was notably less buzz towards United They Stand than many of the previous Marvel animated shows. Not only did the series garner notably lesser viewers than its contemporary shows, but the response to it was often quite negative, with many criticising not only the team's weaker roster of Avengers, but also their characteristics, with many coming across as unlikable and not compelling, in comparison to their comic book counterparts. This mixed response to the show compounded with Fox Kids undergoing major programming changes in the new millennium as a result of several high-profile failures, and the massive success of Kids WB's Pokemon series saw the show only last for one season, and by the time its 13-episode arc had concluded on the 26th of February 2000, the writing was on the wall for Earth's mightiest heroes. The Avengers would unite no more. In a somewhat ironic turn of events, it was the person who pushed for an Avengers series to be brought to the network that ultimately cancelled United They Stand. You see, in February 1999, Fox promoted Roland Poindexter to the role of Vice President of Programming, and upon his promotion, he began to make a number of notable changes to Fox Kids' lineup. You see, by 1999, several high-performing shows such as X-Men and Spider-Man had come to an end, and their successors Avengers and Spider-Man Unlimited had been failing to resonate with audiences. The massive success of Pokemon, which was airing on one of their biggest competitors' networks, was also a driving factor in these changes, as Poindexter ultimately cancelled a number of low-performing shows in an attempt to revamp the channel and win back the viewers that they had lost since Pokemon premiered. Unfortunately, due to its poor reception and diminishing viewing figures, Avengers United They Stand was deemed expendable by the company, and the show came to an end following the conclusion of its first and only season. While I don't think anyone at Fox or Marvel necessarily expected Avengers to succeed at the same level as Spider-Man or the X-Men, given its troubled production and the fact that other Marvel shows had begun to diminish in viewers by this time, it is hard to argue that United They Stand was anything other than an unfortunate failure. That said, despite the lackluster first season, those behind the scenes were hard at work in developing a more intriguing second season, with plans to include more well-known characters such as Thor, the X-Men and the Incredible Hulk, more iconic villains, namely Loki, as well as exploring the backstories of different members of the Avengers team, with a particular focus being placed on Hawkeye and the Scarlet Witch. These plans sadly never came to fruition though, and as such, the show faded away into obscurity, and with it, the once beloved and industry-leading Marvel animated universe was also laid to rest. Overall though, while I don't think that Avengers United They Stand is necessarily terrible, it's hardly at the level an Avengers show deserves to be. The notion of an Avengers cartoon in the same vein as the other Marvel animated series from this time would have virtually any comic book fan excited, but the show we eventually got was so void of the things that made these other shows so popular in the first place. While there were many constraints and problems behind the scenes that hampered this show's production, the series ultimately just fails to resonate and grip its viewers, with few characters feeling truly compelling and relatable. The worst thing any form of media can be is boring, and while I think there are plenty of good and bad parts to United They Stand, it's overall just far less entertaining than the shows that came before it. More than anything, Avengers feels like a missed opportunity, a show that could have been so great and could have made Earth's Mightiest Heroes a household name almost 20 years before they were brought to the big screen, but in execution, it did very little to showcase what it is that makes these characters so beloved. Not only that, but given this show was the last series produced as part of the Marvel animated universe, something that had captured the imagination of so many young viewers and made them fall in love with comic books and superheroes, this series did little to truly send off what had been a beloved and iconic series of shows. And as such, it's clear to me that everyone from the Avengers, the Marvel animated universe, the fans who had eagerly anticipated their favourite heroes being brought to the small screen, and the people behind the scenes who desperately wanted to bring these stories to life, ultimately deserved so much better than Avengers United They Stand. To many comic book fans of a certain generation, the DC animated universe was their gateway into the world of superheroes. Speaking from personal experience, shows such as Batman the Animated Series, Justice League Unlimited, and Superman the Animated Series were my first real introduction to these characters, and played a major role in me falling in love with the medium of comic books. Specifically, the Justice League animated show, which first ran from November 2001 to May of 2004, was my gateway into the wider DC universe. While I was already familiar with the likes of Batman and Superman, it was this series where I first met characters like Green Lantern, The Flash, Martian Manhunter, and Hawkgirl, and their adventures against the likes of Darkseid, Lex Luthor, Vandal Savage, and Brainiac. I don't think it's hyperbole for me to say that this show, as well as its sequel series Justice League Unlimited, are still to this day seen as the definitive versions of the JLA to many. And it's this fact that makes it so surprising that this wasn't actually the original version of the team that Warner Bros. Animation sought to bring to life. In fact, the Justice League animated series underwent a number of significant changes throughout its development. So in this video, I want to break down the history of just how this show came to be, the development process behind the scenes, and the original ideas for what this highly anticipated animated series would be, and how the likes of Bruce Timm, James Tucker, and Rich Fogel ultimately decided on the now iconic roster, and how they were able to, seemingly against all odds, bring the Justice League to life in the world of animation. The DC animated universe began in 1992 with the launch of the now iconic Batman the Animated Series. Brought to life by the team of Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, and Mitch Bryan, this show became a cultural phenomenon, spanning a total of 85 episodes, and in the process redefining the Dark Knight to a whole new generation. And with the show's success, Warner Bros. Were keen to bring in more beloved characters into its expanding world, with Superman the Animated Series premiering in 1996 alongside a follow-up Batman show, The New Batman Adventures, a year later. The Superman show in particular introduced viewers to many different corners of the animated DC universe, introducing villains like Darkseid and Brainiac, as well as other superheroes like Aquaman, The Flash, and the Green Lantern Corps. The show even gave viewers the first meeting between the Man of Steel and the Caped Crusader in the 3-episode story World's Finest. With the success of the animated shows, Warner Bros. Began developing ideas to expand their universe even further, beginning to work on plans for both a Teen Titans animated show as well as a Justice League series. While the Titans cartoon would eventually manifest in the 2003 animated series, albeit this show wasn't connected to any of the other DC cartoons, the Justice League series underwent a number of radical changes throughout the next decade. You see, the first idea was to incorporate the League into Superman the Animated Series, with episodes planned to introduce the likes of Dr. Fate, Black Canary, The Question, and Green Arrow before uniting alongside the Man of Tomorrow in one big climactic episode. These plans were eventually scrapped, with DC President Jeanette Kahn fearing it would be too much to introduce in what was still a relatively new Superman show. As a result, the conversation began to shift to developing a standalone Justice League show. However, senior figures in WB animation, such as Bruce Timm, remained skeptical about whether or not it could actually be done successfully. As Timm explained in an interview with Wizard magazine,
"Truthfully, it's a difficult show to do. It's got all those characters, and it's hard to keep two heroes busy in an action scene at the same time. We do that all the time on the Batman show. When we have Batman, Batgirl, and Robin in a scene together fighting a group of criminals, you get lost. If you follow Batman too long, you wonder what's happening to Robin. It's a logistics thing. It's very difficult."
This stumbling block was ultimately the reason as to why Justice League the Animated Series took so long to be brought to the small screen, and in its place, WB Animation began developing other shows like Batman Beyond and Static Shock. By the turn of the century, both the New Batman Adventures and Superman the Animated Series had concluded, and with it, it seemed like the opportunity to bring the Justice League to life had come and gone. However, in an interesting turn of events, it would actually be a helping hand from the future that would pave the way for Warner Bros. To finally bring their most iconic team to life. While the idea of making a Justice League cartoon never fully went away in the years between Superman's development and the new millennium, with several different ideas being proposed but eventually rejected, it did seem for some time that the studio's vision of bringing DC's greatest ensemble together would never be realised. This began to change though in November of 2000, when Batman Beyond actually introduced a futuristic version of the League in the two-part episode The Call. According to Tim, it was this episode, alongside the success of Grant Morrison's recent JLA comic revamp, that encouraged them to once again try and get this series off the ground. As a result, Tim pitched the idea for a Justice League series to the Kids WB network, tasking James Tucker, a former storyboard artist on Superman the Animated Series, as well as a director for Batman Beyond, to come up with a short demo reel that they could send to the network, advertising the type of show that they imagined it to be. This reel, dubbed Justice League The First Mission, showcased a more futuristic setting for the League, with the team consisting of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkgirl and Martian Manhunter, facing off against notable villains like Lex Luthor, Sinestro and Copperhead. While these would be the League members that viewers would come to know in the eventual series, the reel also included 3 other heroes: Robin, Impulse and a female version of Cyborg. The idea to include these 3 teenage heroes was devised to appeal to the network. However, following a series of disagreements between the production team and the network, Tim scrapped this idea in favour of moving the show to the Cartoon Network. Upon hearing his pitch, Cartoon Network immediately greenlit the series, and gave Tim and co. the license to tell more varied and complex stories in a similar vein to shows like Batman the Animated Series. And as a result, in November of 2001, the 3-part pilot Secret Origins would finally be broadcast to the world, with the Justice League making the long-awaited debut on the small screen. In these episodes, the various members of the League would be brought together by Superman in an attempt to save Earth from a Martian invasion, further fleshing out the established world of the DCAU with higher stakes and intergalactic threats. Following the successful pilot, the initial season would run for a total of 26 episodes, concluding in November 2002. It proved popular enough for Cartoon Network to announce a second season, which would begin the following July. Season 2 was always designed to be the end of this show, with the team planning an epic finale in the 3-part episode Star-Crossed, written by Dan Reber, John Ridley and Dwayne McDuffie. Here, Earth is once again attacked, but this time by the Thanagarians, not only forcing the League to unite the planet and prevent their invasion, but forcing Hawkgirl to choose between her homeworld and her newfound friends, eventually aligning with the Justice League, saving the day and professing her love to Jon Stewart, a subplot which had long been teased throughout both seasons of the show. It was a triumphant end to what had been a long and difficult story of trying to bring the Justice League to life. And although the team would return in subsequent years, those at WB Animation finally had solace knowing that they didn't just succeed in delivering their pledge to create a Justice League cartoon, but they had gone above and beyond, creating one of the most iconic and definitive versions of the Justice League ever brought to the page or the screen. Although Cartoon Network would eventually bring the Justice League back in the form of sequel series Justice League Unlimited, I think it's fascinating to look back at the story of how the original animated series came to be. For a show that was such a formative part of so many people's child and teenagehood, and was their gateway into the wider DC universe and the world of comics, it's almost unbelievable to think that it took over a decade for the League to finally be introduced into the DC animated universe. For the longest time, it actually seemed as if the iconic team would never make their way onto the small screen, destined to always be a project both fans and those at Warner Brothers really wanted to do, but could never quite figure out just how to make it work. Thankfully, the Justice League did eventually make their animated debut, resulting in 2 beloved series that were both a massive part in me discovering my own personal love of superheroes. These shows are still today some of the best and truest depictions of so many incredible DC characters, and demonstrate what makes this company's comic book universe so amazing to a whole new audience. Today, the Justice League animated series is so entrenched into the lore of the DCAU that it's actually hard to imagine what the landscape of superhero television would be without it. Especially when it comes to cartoons, it seriously paved the way for a whole new era of animation, and without it, I don't know if we'd still have some of the other brilliant cartoons that came from both DC and Marvel in the years after its release. The Justice League's success is a massive testament to the likes of Bruce Timm, Rich Fogel, Butch Lukage and Dan Reba for taking a concept that they weren't even sure could live up to its high expectations and eventually deliver something even greater than they could have anticipated. And to think of the series' humble beginnings and the many different ideas that were pitched along the way, it's almost heartwarming to think that against all odds, they were finally able to bring the show to life and do their vision of uniting a team of DC Comics' greatest heroes the justice that it deserves. If you consider yourself to be a 90s kid, then your childhood probably sounded a little something like this. "1994's Spider-Man the Animated Series is still one of the most beloved versions of the friendly neighborhood superhero. Produced by Marvel Animation and written by John Semper Jr., this 5-season show introduced a whole generation of kids to everything that makes Peter Parker so fantastic, bringing the hero and his decades of incredible comic book stories to life in a way unlike anything we'd ever seen before. The series ran from November 1994 to January 1998 and adapted countless classic Spider-Man stories. However, it's the show that came after it that I find even more fascinating. Now, everyone remembers this Spider-Man show, sure, but I very rarely hear anyone mention the 1999 animated series Spider-Man Unlimited. Spider-Man Unlimited was quite unique compared to its predecessor. Set on an alternate Earth, Spider-Man chases down Venom and Carnage, as well as teaming up with a band of freedom fighters to fight the villainous High Evolutionary. To say this show strayed away from the classic Spider-Man status quo is definitely an understatement, but the sheer uniqueness of it all makes me wonder just why it's become so forgotten about. So in this video, I want to dive into the history of how Spider-Man Unlimited was first conceived, the original ideas and plans behind this fresh take on the character, and what the plans were for the show's long-term story beyond its initial 13 episodes, and the lost second season of Spider-Man Unlimited that was planned but never brought to life. The original Spider-Man the Animated Series aired on Fox Kids and proved to be one of the network's most popular shows throughout its 4-year run. Now, after the conclusion of its final season in early 1998, questions between Marvel and Fox began to arise about the future of the partnership. You see, due to the show still maintaining high viewing figures at the time of its conclusion, both companies were keen on securing the rights for Fox to re-air the original 65 episodes. However, in order to do so, Fox asked Marvel to produce a new Spider-Man focused show that would air alongside it. Originally, Marvel's plan was to hire Saban Entertainment, the team behind the original show and the likes of X-Men the Animated Series, to create a motion comic adaptation of the original Stan Lee Steve Ditko comic books. However, these plans fell apart once Sony Pictures acquired the Spider-Man film rights in 1999, with their contract stipulating that Sony would be able to make a new animated series to tie in with their upcoming feature film, resulting in the 2003 short-lived MTV Spider-Man series. Now, while this meant that Marvel could produce a new Spider-Man show in-house, they wouldn't be able to adapt any of the material also used as inspiration for Sony's films or the spin-off cartoons, including the character's origin and backstory, with the terms also stating that while Marvel retained the rights to use the Spider-Man character, they couldn't actually use any of his regular supporting cast. As a result, Marvel and Saban went back to the drawing board and initially considered adapting the popular Spider-Man 2099 comic book, only for DC to release their futuristic sequel to Batman the Animated Series in Batman Beyond that same year. With no immediate ideas springing to mind, Marvel instead gave Saban a list of characters and concepts that they retained the rights to and felt could be translated well into animation. with the list including Venom, Deathlock, the High Evolutionary, and Counter-Earth. Writer Michael Reeves and producer Will Mineo took these concepts and built a story for a new Spider-Man show around it. The initial pitch to Marvel was for Spider-Man to be stranded on Counter-Earth, only to discover that in this alternate world, Uncle Ben was still alive, and that Earth's version of Peter Parker had become evil after discovering the symbiote. Reeves pitched the idea to Marvel's executives in February 1999, who largely liked the fresh take on the character, but hesitated on the idea of featuring two different versions of Spider-Man, due to the recent issues the company had experienced with the Clone Saga. As a result, Uncle Ben and the second Peter were scrapped, in favour of Venom and Carnage arriving on Counter-Earth, with Peter following the two to stop and apprehend them. With these ideas now finalised, Saban and Coco Enterprises began to bring this new animated series to life, and on October 2nd, 1999, the world was first introduced to Spider-Man Unlimited. The original season of Spider-Man Unlimited lasted 13 episodes, running from October 1999 to March of 2001, with the two-part episode Worlds Apart ushering viewers into this new take on the classic hero. The pilot episode sees a spacecraft led by John Jameson heading to the newly discovered Counter-Earth, when the villainous Venom and Carnage attempt to hijack the rocket. Peter Parker, there as the event photographer for the Daily Bugle, suits up as Spider-Man and attempts to fight the two villains, only for the ship to crash and Jameson to be presumed dead. Months later, a transmission arrives from John Jameson, revealing that he's still alive and he made it to Counter-Earth, with Peter, equipped with a new nanosuit designed by Reed Richards, flying to the planet to attempt to rescue him. Upon arriving on Counter-Earth though, Peter discovers a race of anthropomorphic animals called Bestials, who control the planet, with humans reduced to second-class citizens. Spider-Man is then attacked and kidnapped by the Knights of Wundagore, a group of elite mercenaries working for the High Evolutionary, before he manages to escape and discover John Jameson, now the leader of the planet's human resistance. Spider-Man decides to join the cause and vows to stay with Jameson on Counter-Earth until balance is restored and the High Evolutionary is defeated. This introduces the overarching premise of the show, with Spider-Man and the Human Rebellion fighting the Knights and the High Evolutionary, as Peter also attempts to track down Venom and Carnage, who plan on unleashing millions of symbiotes onto Counter-Earth and killing all remaining humans on the planet. Throughout the later episodes though, a number of familiar Spider-Man characters do also show up, though in reimagined ways. Most notably, Episode 3 introduces us to Counter-Earth's version of the Green Goblin, a superhero vigilante who teams up with Spider-Man to fight the Bestials and free New York from their control. Likewise, reimaginings of the Vulture and Electro all make sporadic appearances throughout the later episodes of the show. The climactic episode, entitled Destiny Unleashed, is one of particular note, and sees Venom and Carnage finally enact their master plan, unleashing an entity known as the Synoptic that will take control of all living creatures on Counter-Earth. Spider-Man, John Jameson, Green Goblin and the Rebellion face off against the High Evolutionary and the Bestials, as the symbiotes reject their hosts of Eddie Brock and Cletus Cassidy, as they no longer need them to survive now they have the Synoptic. Peter and the rebels defeat the High Evolutionary and rescue Brock and Cassidy, only to discover that the Synoptic's master plan has already begun, as the city around them becomes engulfed in symbiotes. How will Spider-Man and the gang save the day this time? Well, that's a question that we can't really answer. The cliffhanger ending of Season 1 seemingly raised the stakes for the future episodes of Spider-Man Unlimited. The only problem though was that Spider-Man Unlimited was cancelled after its initial 13-episode run, and the show never got a second season or any real conclusion. The question as to why the show was cancelled is a good one. While the series never reached the levels of popularity that the original Spider-Man show did in 1994, it was by no means a disaster, pulling in high to mid 3.0 ratings throughout its first run of episodes. However, Fox Kids' overall ratings at the time were suffering noticeable declines, with Unlimited first airing in the same time slot as Warner Bros.' wildly popular series Pokemon, It was around this time that Roland Poindexter became Vice President of Programming for Fox Kids, and frequently began to alter the programming schedule to compete with Kids WB and the Pokemon juggernaut, and as a result, Spider-Man Unlimited was put on ice for a year, as the broadcaster began to develop new shows that could rival the likes of Pokemon. As Rick Ungar, former president of the Marvel Character Group, explained,
"What's happening is Fox is dealing with the realities of Pokemon as a competitor. They felt they needed to devote more time to those types of shows, which I understand. What's happening is Fox's Saturday programming has been really fluid. It hasn't been the same from week to week. The real problem is they have a ton of really good shows over there and they're trying to find the right formula to be competitive."
With the network's focus on new shows unchanged, Fox informed Marvel in late 1999 that after airing the delayed episodes of Unlimited's first season, they wouldn't be renewing their agreement for another season. A somber decision, especially given the creative team of the show were deep into planning the story for Unlimited's second season. Larry Brody, one of the main writers for the show, outlined the plot for the first 5 episodes of Season 2, as well as an overall arc for how it would end. The plan for Season 2 would involve Spider-Man and the Rebels stopping the Synaptic, only to discover a merged Venom and Carnage symbiote now threatening to take over the Earth. We would also see more of Counter-Earth be established, including its versions of Latveria and Wakanda, as well as reimaginings of other Spider-Man villains, namely Black Cat. Season 2 would end in a 2-episode finale, much like its premiere, with Spider-Man and the Rebels restoring order and peace to Counter-Earth, as Peter finally returns home. While it was clear that those involved with Spider-Man Unlimited truly believed in this story and aimed to bring resolution to the plots established in the initial season, it simply wasn't meant to be. And by the time that the cliffhanger ending of Season 1 premiered in early 2001, the writing was already very much on the wall for this once promising show. While I don't think Spider-Man Unlimited was necessarily near the level of quality as its predecessor series, I do think there's plenty to praise within this show on its own merit. Following such a successful and long-running show like Spider-Man the Animated Series was never going to be an easy feat, because you couldn't just make another series that directly adapted the Spider-Man comics, because it'd only feel like an imitation of what came directly prior to it. And with that in mind, I think some credit has to be given to both Marvel and Saban for instead thinking outside of the box and attempting to make a show that was visibly and thematically very different from the 1994 series, and would therefore either live or die by its own merits and failures. External factors may have led to the show's cancellation before its story could conclude, but I do still think it's somewhat strange that we never talk about Unlimited when it comes to these classic Marvel animated series. And while it may not reach the upper echelons like Spider-Man, X-Men the Animated Series, or even Spectacular Spider-Man, I do think it's worth a revisit just for the sheer spectacle of this unique take on the beloved superhero, and to wonder what might have been if its run had been anywhere near as unlimited as its name suggested. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on this video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you enjoyed this and you want some more, there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy. If you want to help support the channel and help me make more videos, you can do so over at patreon.com/OwenLikesComics. Or if you just want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics. But that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.